Today in this 7th lecture on ethics, we are going to discuss the objective schools of metaethics. So far, we have discussed the subjective schools of metaethics, which includes simple subjectivism, subjectivism of Mackey, culture relativism, emotivism, and rational constructivism, otherwise known as ideal observer view. In this lecture, we are going to look at the other schools, which are objective schools. So let us try and understand each of these schools briefly. We may not be able to exhaust the ideas of all the schools, but nevertheless we may be able to have a general understanding of these schools. So what do we mean by objective schools? By objective schools, we mean that the claims that we make about morality, it has a meaning independent of the subject who makes the claim. No matter who makes the claim, no matter when the claim is made, no matter where the claim is made. When someone says abortion is wrong, what does it mean? Independent of who says it, when it is said, and where it is said. So this is what we mean by objectivity of moral claims. It is not dependent on the subject who makes in his or her context in a given time. Therefore, this school is also known as moral realism. Now, you know what realism is. Realism means something exists in reality. So when we say moral realism, moral facts exist. They not only exist, but they exist independently of our thoughts about them. So it doesn't matter how we think about it or what we think about it. Those moral facts exist independent of us. They are real. Their existence is real. The existence of moral facts is real. And they exist independent of all of us, all the subjects who speak about morality or who think about morality. Hence, it is objective. So the moral realism normally has three elements: the objectivist element, the cognitivist element, and the metaphysical element. I shall briefly explain each of these. What do we mean by the objectivist element? Moral principles are valid objectively. They do not depend on individual subjects, or on any cultural society. It doesn't need to be validated by individuals or society. It doesn't need to be approved by individuals or society. They are valid on their own right. Take, for example, the moral principle. Murder is wrong. Whether you approve or not, whether your society approves or not, that principle is valid. Why? Because it exists as a fact independent of what you and I think, independent of what a particular cultural society thinks about it. That is why this moral realism very strongly highlights this objectivist element. All objective schools are realist schools, moral realism. The second aspect is the cognitivist element. I made this distinction between cognitivism and non-cognitivism. I said cognitivism implies that the moral statement can be said to be true or false. They are propositions that can be verified to be true or false. Now, some of the subjective schools are also cognitivist. In fact, most of the subjective schools are cognitivist except for one, which is emotivism. When it comes to objective schools, all objective schools must have this cognitivist element. All schools of moral realism must have this cognitivist element. Meaning, all the moral judgments can be verified or evaluated or judged as true or false. The third aspect is the metaphysical element. Metaphysical here would imply that the existence of moral facts in the metaphysical realm, in the etymological sense of the term, not in the physical realm. They don't exist like the material things exist in the physical universe. They exist in the metaphysical realm. Moral facts exist in reality, but not in the physical reality, not in the reality that you and I can know through our external senses. We cannot see that, we cannot touch it, we cannot smell it, we cannot hear it, we cannot sense it through our eternal senses. But they exist in metaphysical realm. Something like what religious people would tell about God. Well, the existence of God is metaphysical because you cannot touch Him, sense Him in the normal understanding of knowing Him through external senses. One can say, I can feel God's presence. Yes, that is more in a very metaphorical sense. But in the way you can touch or see a physical object, you cannot touch or see God. Or certain values that you have. For example, friendship. Is friendship real? If it is it real in the same sense as the table, the chair, the pen, the carpet, the computer, the mobile? Is it in the same sense? No. What makes it different? You cannot see friendship. You cannot touch friendship. But you still think that exists. That existence would be metaphysical existence. So moral facts exist as metaphysical reality. So these are the three aspects to make something a moral realism. So all these schools which we are going to discuss as part of the objective schools, they are schools of realism, moral realism. Now there are three different types of moral realism or moral realists we can think of. The first one is the theistic moral realism. The second one is naturalistic moral realism. The third one is non-naturalistic moral realism. Now please note, the theistic moral realism and naturalistic moral realism we have already discussed as part of normative ethics. The theistic moral realism basically means moral facts exist as part of God's creation, God's plan. They exist in the form of God's commandment. Obviously, which school suggests that? The divine command theory. So therefore, this school can be also considered the supernaturalistic theory or supernaturalistic moral realism, because it comes from the supernatural agency. It's part of the plan of the supernatural being, namely God. Since we have already discussed the divine command theory, what the theory is and what the problems are, we don't need to get into it right now. So it is the same argument again, so I don't need to repeat it. If you need to know more about it, you can go and check that video recording of that lecture. Naturalistic moral realism. We have also discussed this as part of normative ethics. That is known as the natural law theory, the proponent of which is St. Thomas Aquinas. Morality, moral facts exist as part of nature, of course, of human nature. It is inbuilt in the human nature. You just need to discover that which is in the human nature. We have discussed again extensively that idea of naturalism, and that belongs to the natural law theory belongs from the metaethical point of view into the naturalistic moral realists. There are other schools which are non-naturalistic moral realists, And for want of time, I shall be discussing only one school, which is known as Intuitionism. Now, according to this school, Intuitionism, which is advocated by many thinkers, of which G.E. Moore is one of the great champions, good does not mean I approve of something. Good does not mean my society permits it to do. Good does not mean, in fact, anything. Good is a term which is very simple and therefore it cannot be defined. Now you have to pay attention to the words I am using. It's a simple idea. Any simple idea cannot be defined. Which idea can be defined? The composed idea can be defined. In order to define something, you must be able to break what it is composed of to explain it. Simpler idea cannot be defined. Now there is a reason many theists would say God is a simple idea. It doesn't mean simple in the normal understanding of the term. God cannot be defined in human terms. It is not a composed idea. So Moore gives the example, can you define yellow? You cannot define yellow. You can define color, but you cannot define yellow. What is yellow is just known to you by what he calls intuition. You intuitively know it, this is yellow. It cannot be further explained. So also good is a simple idea that cannot be defined. Good is indefinable. That is the basic idea. In every other school we have discussed, particularly the subjective schools, there is a meaning of good which can be precisely given. Here it cannot be because it is indefinable. If good is indefinable, all that we know about good is through our intuition. What does that mean? We know intuitively when something is right or wrong. You don't need a elaborate way of explaining this is right or this is wrong. We just know it. It's just like if you are having a very smart mind, you don't need a calculator to do an equation or a simple math. 7 times 7, you will immediately say the answer. 7 times 7, 49. You intuitively know it because you have a smart mind. So also in morality, if you have a mature mind, underline these words. If you have a mature mind, you know intuitively what is right and wrong. Now obviously, Moore cannot prove this intuition. This is a kind of strange kind of faculty. What is this intuition? He cannot prove it. We have something called intuition. Then when people ask him, well, how do you prove this intuition? He said, I have no reason to prove. I know intuitively that intuition is there. If you want to disprove it, the burden is on you. The burden of proof rests on you to prove me there is no intuition. So he was cleverly arguing with his opponents, It's a very juridical term to say the burden of proof rests with the opponent, not with me. I don't need to prove intuition. I know it exists because I intuit all the time. If you don't agree with that, you better prove to me that it doesn't exist. Well, but this obviously leaves his position, his ethical debate in a weak position, because if you cannot prove and you are simply passing on the burden onto the opponent, your position is not all that strong. So basic points to retain: good is indefinable, you just intuitively know it. Now remember, we often use this word intuition in our everyday life. I somehow intuit this is not right, but we cannot really figure out what it is. We'll say sometimes like a gut feeling I have. I have some kind of, I somehow think it's not right. You're not clear in explaining what it is. So we all come across that. So Moore says, yes, that precisely is it. We can intuit if you have a mature mind. That is important. If you don't have a mature mind, if you are not smart enough, you cannot figure out a math. So also, if you don't have a mature mind, then you will not be able to intuitively know what is right or what is wrong. There is another thinker by name H. Pritchard. He argues not only the moral values, Moore was insisting on mostly on the values. We know moral values intuitively. Pritchard, on the other hand, would say not only the values, even the duties, even the moral obligations, we can know just like we can know mathematics. The moment I know 1 plus 1, when I see that, I know the answer is 2. I don't need a proper, I don't need an elaborate explanation to show 1 plus 1 equals 2 or 2 plus 2 equals 4. So also my obligations are known to me intuitively. So Pritchard takes Moore one step ahead. I not only know what is morally good, but I also know what is morally right and wrong in terms of my obligation, what I should do or what I should not do. So he also places a stress on obligation, on duty, not only on moral values. Now when I speak about values and duties, you should keep this in mind. This is one of the important distinctions in metaethics, values and norms. Values are something from which norms are derived. For example, if you tell me stealing is wrong, I could ask you, from which value do you derive this norm, stealing is wrong? Stealing is wrong is a norm. A norm normally deals with what you should do or what you shouldn't do. For example, you should not steal. Let me put it that way, that makes it clearer. It is a prohibition as opposed to something that is permissible or an obligation. It's a prohibition. You should not steal. Now, from where do you derive this moral principle, moral norm? Well, the value is honesty. A honest person would not steal. So metaethics does make this distinction between value and norm. Norms are dependent on values. That is why very often some people say, well, norms are important, but don't forget the values which the norms enshrine. Otherwise, you will be doing the norms without really knowing what the values are behind it. And sometimes you may have to, some people will go to the extent of saying, you may have to sometimes revise the norms so that the value is not lost. I mean, simple example, for example, the observance of Sabbath. You have heard that in the book of Bible. You should observe the Sabbath. Well, what is the value behind it? If observing the Sabbath in a very blind way goes against the very value it is supposed to embody, then it has to be revisited. The value behind observing the Sabbath is to ensure the humans have dignity and they deserve at least one day of rest. And that is the value of human dignity. But on the contrary, if in the name of Sabbath you begin to choke the humans and you deprive them of their dignity, then you need to revisit that norm. So norms are constantly revisited from the point of view of values. Nevertheless, Pritchard thought moral intuition not only lets us intuit values, but also norms or the obligation. The norms are the ones which gives us obligation, what we should do, what we shouldn't do. So the advantage of the view of Pritchard is that we have not only values to follow, but obligations derived from the values we have, and we need to fulfill it. So this is something that people consider very positive about the way he has understood human nature. It's not that we just know the values intuitively. Some people sometimes know, okay, these are values. Oh, but because these are values, I have certain obligations to do certain things. So it is also a commanding. It has certain, it influences me, it persuades me to act. So it has a very positive outlook to our human nature. The third person, you are familiar with this gentleman, Sir William David Ross. We have discussed his ideas as part of the deontological school. So Ross developed this idea of prima facie duties. Now, these duties are apparent, meaning to say they are evident to us at the very first sight. They are evident to us because they are given to us to our intuition. So, basically, Ross is an intuitionist. He says there are duties that are evident and apparent. They are just seen right before us. At the very first sight, we intuit them as duties. Now, you know about his other theories. For the development of his theory, I don't need to explain that. One of those prima facie duties in a given context becomes an overriding duty. And again, that you can intuit it. You don't need to sit and do an elaborate calculation about that. You just can intuit which is the most compelling duty in this situation. It is given to your intuition. Now, what are some of the strengths of Intuitionism? Obviously, the first strength is we can know what good is directly through our intuition. It is like some people say that I can intuit the presence of God. I can know directly through my intuition that God is with me all the time. So we hear some religious people saying that, but here it is about the moral value. Good is directly known through my intuition. Another important strength is in fact, came strongly on people who were trying to define what good is. He called this as a naturalistic fallacy. Why it is a fallacy? People wrongly identify good with something else. They are constantly making a mistake. In fact, good cannot be defined. You try to define it, and in the process, you try to identify good with something. For example, you try to identify good with what you like, what you prefer, or good with what your society approves of. That is not what good is. Good is just known to you through intuition, directly known. You can apprehend it straight. Now, this argument of this naturalistic fallacy of Moore is very persuasive, it's very convincing. Why? Because if you ask ourselves what really good is, we constantly give certain meanings which are not really what good is. Good cannot be just what I like. What I like may be sometimes bad. So we are confusing the idea of good with something else. So therefore, this is another strength of Intuitionism, or the thinkers who suggest or propose Intuitionism. Now, another strength is the duties are self-evident. So we know what our duties are, and that gives a very positive outlook of human nature. Humans as we are, we have duties. And duties make us what we are, and it tells us what we ought to be. That not only helps us to be what we are, but also helps us to be better versions of ourselves. Because fulfilling of the duty always enables us to become better. So there is a way in which the human nature is seen as positively able to move forward. That is why it has a positive outlook towards human nature. So we are not merely fallible human beings, but we are also human beings capable of all the time striving ahead in terms of fulfilling our duties. So these are some of the strengths of Intuitionism. Now let us come to the weaknesses of Intuitionism. What are some of the weaknesses we have? Well, they all say good is something self-evident, you cannot deny, and so on. But even there seems to be some differences of opinion among all these intuitionists. Moore is more a teleologist. He thought of good in a teleological way. Basically, Moore was highlighting the importance of how the good can lead you towards the goal of happiness and the appreciation of beauty. So its teleological is value based, so therefore he is also what is known as axiological, the value based theory. I have not put the word here, but it is spelled Axiology. Axiology means study of values. It's also value based, axiological, but also teleological. Whereas Ross is deontological. We know it's emphasizing duty, therefore deontology. So there are also differences there. They have no clear agreement of what this moral good is, except for the fact they say it is indefinable and you can know through intuition. On other aspects of good, they diverge. They have different opinions. Another major weakness of Intuitionism is it is highly individualistic in its approach to ethics. It does not give us any concrete justification for the ethical behavior we have. All that it says at the end is good is indefinable. So, well, good is indefinable, but how do I justify my ethical behavior? Just because I intuit something? Can you go wrong in your intuition? And what justifies this is the right intuition? None of these things is clear in the school of Intuitionism. And with that, I conclude this lecture. So we have so far discussed most of the subjective schools, and today we have discussed one of the objective schools, because two other schools we have already studied as part of normative ethics. There are many other schools which probably we may not be able to do it because we have got just one more day, and then I would like to take up some ideas from Habermas and Levinas. In fact, I normally discuss many thinkers, but at least two of them it may be helpful for us to learn for our life, but also as part of this course. So thank you very much. Have a very good day.